Geek Legion of Doom really is the thinking man's channel.
Marcel Walls directs Master of the Universe. You might have clicked on this review thinking it was something else, but this is in fact a mockbuster from the Asylum. Yes, it is a mockbuster from the upcoming Masters of the Universe movie. So, if you want a cheaper alternative, here it is. So, Master of the Universe, the Asylum, what's it all about? In case you don't know, the Asylum is a low-budget production company based in the US that primarily makes mockbusters, cheap imitations of popular IP designed to cash in with a similar sounding name to much more recognisable franchises and pop out a cheap B-movie around the kind of time of release to lure in unsuspecting viewers. Sometimes these Asylum movies can be quite fun. What's the story of this one, and does it have any similarities to He-Man and the Masters of the Universe? So this takes place in a kind of, another universe, I suppose, where we have a alien society, which is kind of a little bit like the Masters of the Universe, where it's partial sci-fi, partial kind of fantasy. So there is that, and we have Prince Eli, who is the kind of the prince of this kingdom, and he is and his kingdom come under threat from an evil force who has a planet-destroying device to kind of strip all the resources, and which ultimately results in the destruction of the planet. So now Prince Eli must recruit a band of heroes to try and defend his realm. What will happen? You'll have to watch the movie and find out. So are there any similarities? Well, like I said, you have a kind of situation where the setting is a kind of techno-fantasy world, kind of like Masters of the Universe. You have fantasy, magic elements, along with science fiction and kind of technological elements as well. So there is that. Prince Eli has a kind of magical weapon. He has a mysterious sister that we learn about partway through the movie. A bunch of heroes, a bunch of villains, some kind of spaceships and stuff, Maybe there's a few kind of like, obviously, things you could point to, and so that's a little bit similar. Anyway, let's talk about what works. And yeah, this is a very low budget movie, so bear that in mind. And it's obviously very quickly produced. What does work? I will say, if you're familiar with the Asylum's work to this point, their CGI has improved quite dramatically. So there are some reasonable kind of CGI. So what do I mean by that? We get a few shots of spacecraft and kind of alien tech and things like that. And this day and age, I think it looks pretty good. I mean, there was once upon a time this looked terrible, but I gotta say, I think the CGI has come a long way for kind of low budget filmmakers. So there's now some sort of reasonable shots of drop ships, as they call them, and there's kind of world engine machine, things like that. There's also a few kind of magical effects which are overlaid on the kind of the live action kind of scenarios, which are quite good. They're quite good for kind of low budget fare. I think this is a movie where, although it has a couple of deaths and stuff, although it's not a gory film, it's very clear to find good guys and bad guys. One element which I kind of liked, I suppose, which is a little different from the official kind of He-Man and stuff, is that the king, Prince Eli's father, is actually not well liked by his people. So Prince Eli, in trying to recruit people, actually has a little bit of an uphill battle, because his father is tyrannical in his own right, at least to the point of view of these kind of common folk. So it's a little bit of a difference there, at least. Gives it a little bit more of a dynamic, I suppose. Out of our characters, there's a kind of like an Evil-Lyn stand-in, who's the kind of like the witch sorceress, I guess, from our bad guys. She's probably the most fun character. Her costume is probably the most interesting. You know, and she seems sort of deliciously evil in her kind of her own right, so that was kind of quite fun. Probably the most interesting character, I will say. So there's that. There's a couple of kind of very quick fights, which some of the choreography I thought was okay. So yeah, there's a little bit to enjoy here if you just want a very, you know, lowbrow, quickly produced kind of sci-fi actioner. All right, what doesn't work? What makes Masters of the Universe fun? It is the larger-than-life, over-the-top characters. Every character in Masters of the Universe is very unique looking. They have their own abilities, they have their own looks. They're very distinct, very kind of like easy to kind of tell apart and have very sort of unique abilities and things like this. This is sort of the fun thing about the Masters of the Universe IP. However, conversely, this one, it is the most boring collection of characters, the most generic looking collection of heroes and villains you've seen in a movie. How difficult would it have been to really have A, interesting characters, B, interesting kind of costumes, you know, a little bit of variety. What is our bad guy, our Skeletor standing? Well, he's a middle-aged guy with a beard. That's what you get. What's He-Man like? He looks more like Peter Parker, I have to say. Tom Holland's Peter Parker. Even the cover of this very film is actually nothing like the actual movie, I have to say. But we get the kind of the minions and of both the good and evil side, all of them, maybe with the exception of the Evil-Lyn stand-in, are so vanilla, so generic. They are just boring characters. They're just boring fantasy archetypes. No character whatsoever. Their actual aesthetic look is boring. It's like Temu style sort of fantasy stuff. You know what I mean? There's nothing interesting to look at. They're not unique in any particular way. They're just kind of boring fantasy archetypes. I guess this works somewhat in its favour, but the fact that this is a kind of both mixing technology and kind of fantasy elements, I guess they can use kind of modern architecture and stuff like that to kind of, because it's not meant to be historical or anything like that. But you know, it looks like it's just taking place in some building, you know, some warehouse and things like that quite often. So outside of a couple of virtual sets and things like that, and there's a couple of external shots where you're in the snow, which I quite liked, but a lot of it is just like generic, this is where we've got to film, like, you know, a warehouse and things. The acting, I mean, look, He-Man is a children's toy commercial, basically. You can't really, you know, criticise this necessarily for being hammy acting, but it's really hammy acting. Everyone's trying to do a kind of English style, kind of medieval inspired sort of Dungeons and Dragons themed sort of heroic way they're speaking, but the acting is terrible. You know, terrible pretty much across the board. Again, maybe you can accept this because this is a mockbuster of a property which is no one is going to really probably level any acting awards at, let's be honest. We're talking about the real property, let alone the mockbuster. But yeah, it's noticeably cheesy and trite. I mean, again, maybe you can be kind of like forgiven with that. One of the problems I often level at asylum movies is its tendency to have conversations in rooms rather than having a lot of spectacle on screen, which requires stuntmen, choreography, special effects, costuming, whatever, explosions. It's mostly conversations in rooms. The few sort of action sequences that we do get, relatively short. Not particularly exciting, but you know, I can forgive it to a degree if we had interesting characters, interesting, you know, costuming and stuff like that, and maybe a few different kind of locations and stuff, but it's just boring sort of dialogue, which is delivered pretty hammily by generic looking characters with uninspired costumes, with cheesy sort of like computer generated music, which just sounds like it sounds generic as hell. So it's just like they could have been an interesting He-Man rip-off. I remember because I'm not that old, when the He-Man actual original toy line came out and the cartoon, there used to be like these fake bootleg figures, but I still quite like them because they were kind of quite interesting. They were like dragon heads and things like this. You know, you could have done a version that would have been at least that good. You know, at least they had interesting characters, but this is just like guys with beards, generic looking Temu outfits. Look, there's some sort of, if you just want to watch a sci-fi film, in a way it almost feels a little bit more like Battle Beyond the Stars, I've got to say. Maybe there's some lowbrow entertainment here to put on in the background, but it's pretty uninspired. 4 out of 10. What were your thoughts? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.
Today's message is about B-movie loving and hitting that thumbs up button.